We now take a look at some of those nation states of Europe as they begin to consolidate together and make larger nations, such as France, Spain, the Dutch Republic. Then we'll see England under Elizabeth I and the Spanish Armada. And then we'll take a look at Eastern Europe with Russian absolutism, and finally Poland, Lithuania. In order to understand the nation states of Europe, as well as the nation states of Asia and so forth, you need to understand the difference between absolutism and constitutionalism. Now, remember, I had mentioned the term absolutism earlier when we were looking at the Mughals in India. That was an absolutist style of rule. Now, France, Spain, and Russia provide models of absolutist rule. Now, under absolutism, the king, the regent, or the ruler claimed absolute, uncontested power. The king claimed the divine right of rule. Power descended from God onto the king, and then the king wielded that power onto the people. Now, absolutist rule is very effective in maintaining profitable economic policies. France's Louis XIV, whom you saw in the picture earlier on the chapter beginning. Spain's Philip II. They epitomized absolutist rule. On the other side were England and the Netherlands. These were constitutional governments. Now, in a constitutional government, such as a constitutional monarchy, the king or queen or the sovereign still claimed the divine right. That power descended from God onto that king. However, he or she shared power with Parliament, which was made up of elected rulers. And so therefore, power was not just simply wielded by the king onto the subjects, but instead shared with other rulers. This is the essence of constitutional power, the sharing of power. And then eventually what's going to happen is that during the Enlightenment, constitutional rule is going to be revised to show that power flows upward from the people toward the sovereign or the ruler or the government. Let us first look at the consolidation of France. France was ruled by the Guise family, and their head was Catherine de' Medici, a Florentine-born queen mother who was regent to her son, Charles IX of France. But the throne of France was still largely uncertain even at this time, and it was being challenged by the junior branch of the royal family, which called themselves the Bourbons. Now, existing in France and living in France at this time are French Calvinists known as Huguenots. Now, I made mention of the Huguenots earlier when I talked about the settlers down at Table Bay in the South African region. Huguenots were French Calvinists who, on August the 24th, 1572, were slaughtered en masse. This is known as the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre. What happened is that a Huguenot leader, Gaspard Coligny, had an attempt on his life. It failed. And the Catholics, in anger, decided that rather than take accountability for what happened, they rose up and executed Huguenot leaders throughout the entire country. Between 10,000 and 100,000 Huguenots were murdered. Many of them would leave France and go to places like South Africa or to the American colonies. For instance, one particular family was the Riviere family that then anglicized its name to Revere, as in Paul Revere. The Huguenots, after St. Bartholomew's Day, lost much of their political power and became radicalized. So you would think that if you survived the assassination attempt, you would want to go off on the warpath. Instead, it's the ones who failed that went off on the warpath. And so Huguenots were largely ostracized from French society and not allowed to practice their faith for close to a full century. Now, you will recall that the throne of France was in a very unstable situation. Part of the reason was the French rulers were not having any legitimate heirs of their own, and you also had the specter of assassination. And the big problem is that after Charles IX died of tuberculosis, Henry III, his brother, took over, also without issue, and then he was assassinated. At this point, the French nobles and the court go to Henry of Navarre, who is a cousin of the king. He's not a Catholic, though, but he will eventually become Good King Henry, or as he's well known, the Gallant Green. Henry was chosen because he married the sister of the king. But Henry had to convert to Catholicism to take the throne of France, because the throne of France, the King of France, is known as the most Catholic king of France. Henry, upon considering, supposedly said, well, I think Paris is worth a mass, and he converted. And he became Henry IV, first king of the line of the Bourbon family. So remember, bourbon's not something you drink. Originally, it is the name of the royal house of France. Henry will be the grandfather of Louis XIV, the Sun King. Now, his initiatives were simple. The Spanish tried to invade during his rule, and he pushed them out. And then he issued what was known as the Edict of Nantes in 1598. And this is where he turns to his Huguenots, who he was a member of at one time, the Protestant Calvinists in France, and he says, okay, you all are welcome back in, no problem. We will let you practice your faith once more. Henry also creates a very strong bureaucracy to offset the nobles who were constantly intriguing. And he also ordered the colonization of Nova Scotia, which comes to be known as Acadie, or Acadia in our language. Now, Henry himself also fell victim to assassination. A fanatical Frenchman and Catholic assassinated him because he did not like the Edict of Nantes. But by this point, the throne of France is now secure in the hands of the Bourbons. And from Henry IV all the way until the mid-1830s, the throne of France will remain in the hands of the Bourbon kings. Now, across the Pyrenees was one of the most interesting and complex of all the rulers of Europe. Philip II of Spain was the son of Charles V, who was the Holy Roman Emperor, and he was also the King of Spain, Carlos I of Spain, and Philip was his son. Philip annexed Portugal into the Spanish realm and seized their throne. He had married Mary Tudor, who was the daughter of Henry VIII and his wife, Catherine of Aragon. And so by that marriage, he also claimed the English throne. Philip had very grand ideas of what was owed to him. He believed himself to be God's instrument of restoring Catholic unity to Europe. And because of this, he had, shall we say, a rather violent temper. And in his fury, he sacked and pillaged the city of Antwerp in Belgium in 1576. It was not called Belgium back then, it was simply called the Spanish Netherlands. Calvinists and Catholics in the Netherlands then unite against the Spanish, expelled the Spanish invaders, and set up an independent state in defiance of Philip. In so doing, the people of the Netherlands created the first of the modern states, which is known as the Dutch Republic. Now, the Dutch Republic is a constitutional state and it functions as a republic, which is nominally led by the House of Orange. And so when you see the Dutch today, they'll wave their red, white, and blue flags, but many of them will wear orange as a symbol, a token of their country, because that's the ruling house. The Dutch Republic had a very decentralized government. Local rulers or regents wielded more power than actually the king did. The king was more of a CEO than an actual divine monarch. There was a large degree of religious toleration. Jews were allowed in. This is the time in which the Frank family probably migrated into the Netherlands. There was a great deal of focus on economic growth and colonial expansion. No time to worry about religious differences. We have money to make, say the Dutch. They contract an English explorer named Henry Hudson, who goes and sails, and he goes to East Asia, and then he goes to the Americas. The Dutch become tremendous financiers with their stock market and their great banks. And their stock market in Amsterdam is the oldest stock market in the world. And in addition to that, there's a large degree of scientific freedom. The Dutch did not care what the churches had to say about whether the earth revolved around the sun. They simply said, if you are a scientist, we will give you the leeway to develop the science that you need to develop. And this becomes the hallmark of the Dutch Republic for a long time. Here is a map of the Low Countries around the year 1477, and you see basically what is the nations of the Netherlands and Belgium today, and the Dutch Republic with its capital at Amsterdam, also the cities of Antwerp in Belgium, and I also circled the port city of Calais because it is closest to England across the Straits of Dover. Now, over in jolly old England, things were far from, shall we say, jolly. When Henry VIII died, the throne passed to his young son, Edward VI, who did not live past the age of 16. And so the House of Tudor was in something of a bit of jeopardy. But the court nobles and the English Parliament decided that they would retain the House of Tudor for stability. Remember, England had just come out of the long War of the Roses, in which the Tudors were put in on the throne. Well, Henry had no further male heirs after Edward died, and so the throne now passes to his daughter Mary, better known as Bloody Mary, Mary Tudor. She was the daughter of Henry's first wife, Catherine of Aragon of Spain. As such, she was therefore the cousin of Charles V of the Holy Roman Emperor, who was also therefore King Carlos I of Spain. She therefore was then the cousin and the wife of Philip II of Spain, Charles V's son. She attacked non-Catholics in her realm with an incredible fury, which got her nickname Bloody Mary. But she died after only 4.5 years. It is believed that she may have inherited her father's mental disease or had contracted some other sort of disease. And so when she died, the throne now passes to her half-sister, Elizabeth, who becomes Elizabeth I of England. Elizabeth was the half-sister of Mary. She was not the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, but instead the daughter of Anne Boleyn, Henry's mistress and then second wife. This made her also a cousin of Philip II of Spain. And Philip II, after Mary died, said that you shall marry me now, Elizabeth. To which Elizabeth said, I don't think so. She never married. Hence, she was given the title the Virgin Queen. It's not to say that she didn't have sexual relations. It just means that she never married. She would keep English government oriented toward the Protestant side of the Reformation. She tried at first to strike a balance between Catholic and Protestant forces, but tended to side more with the Protestant forces. She is nicknamed by Philip, who is a Catholic monarch, as the English Jezebel for this. And her rejection of him infuriated him to no end, and he vowed his revenge on all of England and Elizabeth. There in the upper left, you see the very dour looking Mary Tudor as she holds the red rose that is the symbol of the House of Tudor. In the lower right is her half sister Elizabeth, around the age of 13, well before she assumed the throne of England. The reign of Elizabeth was, at the very start, quite insecure, but as she began to get older in age and began to dispatch many of her enemies, she began to dispense with the intrigue and threats, both from outside and from within the realm. She sent troops to the Netherlands to support the Dutch Republic, in their fight against the Spanish. Not because the English liked the Dutch so much, they just hated the Spanish more, and the enemy of my enemy is my friend. She also sent out a privateer named Sir Francis Drake, who may have been one of her lovers, and his job was simple: prey upon Spanish shipping, especially all that Spanish gold that is coming from the New World. She also executed her cousin, Mary Stuart, better known as Mary, Queen of Scots, who had been in prison for quite a long time, and removed that threat to the throne. She exerted English power over Ireland and its rebellious Catholic lords, and the two leading Catholic lords, called Twilight Lords of the Irish resistance, their names were Gerald Fitzgerald and James Fitzmaurice. She also attempted to steer a middle course between the Puritan factions of the Protestants. These are the Calvinists. They're called Puritans because they wanted to purify the churches of stained glass and statuary and all religious images. And the Catholic extremists, representing Philip II's wishes in England. And for all this, she earned the wrath of Philip II, as I said before. She was labeled the English Jezebel, and Philip now makes it his mission to remove Elizabeth from the throne, or shall we say try to remove Elizabeth from the throne. Philip resolved to make good on his threat to remove Elizabeth from the throne, take the throne of England himself, and restore the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church to England. Financed with all that gold that had come in from Cortez's Mexico and Pizarro's Peru, he begins to build the Spanish Armada. Armada is simply a Spanish name for navy. This was considered the greatest and the most powerful fleet in the world. And Philip's plan was very simple. He would use his great armada to destroy the smaller English navy. He would then land troops in Holland, the Netherlands, and would conduct a cross-channel invasion in England. He would then remove Elizabeth from the throne, put her in prison, and then execute her, carry her head through the streets of London. He would then restore Catholicism to England, and he would place himself on the English throne. It was a modest plan, to say the least. The problem is that the plan that Philip had looked great on paper, but in reality, things were much different. The first thing is that Sir Francis Drake led a raid on the Armada in its home port of Cadiz. Now, interestingly enough, think about that. An enemy fleet raids another fleet in its home port. That's going to be used again. Secondly, Philip became very ill during the preparations and nearly died. And without his guidance, the project really lost its direction. And so, by a sheer feat of human strength, he pulls himself out of the bed and returns to the planning. When it finally set sail from Cadiz, the storms hindered the progress of over 130 ships. The weather seemed to have been almost like a divine wind sent against the Spanish. And when they set sail with such haste and such ill preparation that many of them had the wrong ammunition. Now, I want you to go back in time to the 4th century BC. And there, of course, you will remember that the Greeks and the Persians engaged in a series of war, and we're all familiar with the story of the Stand of the 300 and that awful movie that Frank Miller wrote based on the Frank Miller book and so forth. But in truth, the Greeks did defeat the Persians, and one of the great battles was the Battle of Salamis, which was a naval battle in which the Persian fleet, which outnumbered the Greeks and was much larger than the Greeks, was nonetheless defeated because the Greeks fought on terms of their own choosing in narrow waters where the larger Persian ships could not maneuver as well. And the English do the exact same thing to the Spanish. The smaller English and Dutch ships could maneuver better in the narrow English Channel. And the English also send fire ships, literally a ship that is nothing more than a rotten hulk of wood, stuffed with as much wood and oil and tinder as possible, and you set it on course for the nearest ship, and it'll catch the other ship on fire. When the battle is over, the Armada has to sail through the Straits of Dover into the North Sea, which is a really nasty place altogether, even in the best of times. And the storm scatters the rest of the Armada and drives it around the north coast of Scotland. Finally, the remains of the Armada come limping back to Cadiz. Philip's plan has shattered in the English Channel. Elizabeth has won this battle, and England remains safe from Spanish invasion. The defeat of the Armada tipped the balance of power when it came to naval warfare. England remained Protestant, and Elizabeth had been proclaimed a hero of the realm. As the English army sits at the Straits of Dover awaiting the Spanish invasion, Elizabeth herself shows up in full armor. When the generals say that you are a woman, ma'am, and you cannot be fighting with us, Elizabeth says, I may have the body of a woman, but I have the heart of a lion, and I will stand here to die with you if necessary, but England will be victorious, to which the entire army roared in approval. Philip sulked back to his throne in Madrid. He was unable to restore Catholicism to Europe. When Spain began a decline, this does not mean that Spain followed the by no means. The long decline will take 3 and 10 years. It's not until 1898 when Spanish political power and Spanish naval power is permanently passed by the United States for what is known as the Spanish Empire. Elizabeth ruled 1603, she finally passed away, and this brings the anniversary to her as Elizabeth the Consul, which is there. And so, the throne is now under herself. Queen VI of Scotland is the son of the Queen of Scots, because King James I begins to England now becomes the master of the waves. England is now on the rise and will become the rulers of the seas. Britannia will rule for the next 4 centuries and will not be replaced as the prime navy force until the end of the Second World War. Across the continent we go to Russia and look at the absolutism that is Russian absolutism, a very unique brand of Russian absolutism. And I give us the person of Ivan Vasilievich, the Grand Duke of Moscow. The man had a very cruel streak, a ferocious temper, but it is that cruel streak and ferocious temper that actually helped drive him to build the Russian Empire. Part of it was a sort of an homage to his son, whom he killed in a fit of anger. He attempted then to expand west into Europe, but was blocked by the Poles, the Lithuanians, and the Swedes. Because of his terrible temper, he was given the nickname Ivan Grozny, which means the terrible. He ruthlessly persecuted Orthodox priests, and numerous others that he perceived as a threat. And yet, he united Russia into a single political entity and became the first Tsar of Russia, which is the Russian way of saying Caesar. He was an absolute ruler, or an autocrat, which means that even in most countries that are absolutist, you have a court of advisors that will help make decisions for you. In an autocracy, there are still advisors, but the total, complete look of power comes from the Tsar himself. He becomes the big brother to all the Russian people, the father of the Russian people. That is what an autocrat is. And autocracy will work to a certain degree for the Russian people, but eventually it's going to bring their downfall during the First World War. There is a portrait of Ivan Grozny, the Terrible. How would you like to have to live with that and have that staring at you during court meetings and so forth? Bordering on Russia to the west was the commonwealth known as Poland-Lithuania. This region, this realm, encompassed modern-day Poland, Lithuania, Belarus, and Latvia, as well as parts of the Ukraine, which has been in the news recently, Estonia, and of course Western Russia. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was a semi-federal union of states. And remember what a federal union is the states control their own affairs within themselves, and yet they join together in a common government that will handle the national affairs like defense and trade and things like that. This was an early form of constitutional monarchy in which there is a sovereign, there is a king, a monarch, but the monarch is largely relegated to the periphery, and the real work of government is done by a parliament. So this is a constitutional form of government. Most Polish and Lithuanians were Roman Catholic, but there was a large degree of religious tolerance. And one of the areas in which it was originally very tolerant was of Jews. And in fact, Jews had been recruited to come into the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth because the Jews had the necessary skills in certain trades to help jumpstart and then coordinate the Polish-Lithuanian economy. Now, this map here shows how the Russian Empire begins to spread out from its little Grand Duchy in and around the city of Moscow until it begins to move out into the Siberian steppes and begins to push against the states of Western Europe. And you get to see here exactly how the Russian Empire grows. Now, remember, the word Russia itself comes from the Viking, the Rus, as they called it. And the Vikings had established a great series of trading states along the Volga River and so forth. And so the Russians also begin to build upon this old trading empire that the Vikings had. In this map, you see here the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And you can see where the modern-day country of Poland is located, and as well as the modern-day countries of Ukraine, Belarus, the Baltic states, and so forth. You get to see that this was a very important state on the Baltic and had access to the Black Sea in part and controlled much traffic. And this became a very wealthy corner of the world for a while.